Hey everyone, today we're going to be looking at how I won my first national title of juniors under 18 here in Portugal. So it was held last year in September of last year, and let's see how that went. So my first round I was paired up against a 1500 player. I was white, I started c4, and we soon reached a pan of attack. So this by transposition is a pan of attack. It usually reaches this position through a Caro-Kann like this. As you can see, we get the exact same position we have here in the game. It is a very common opening, and it has a lot of lines. I chose the c takes d5 line. Knight takes, bishop d3. So in all these moves, there are basically ramifications and other variations. It's a very theory-dense opening. So bishop e7, castles, castles, rook e1, and now there are a lot of lines for black. Some include knight f6, bishop f6, knight cb4, and knight takes c3 are all viable options. However, my opponent played h6, which I consider to be an inaccuracy already. The reasoning, well, h6 is a logical move, right? He wants to stop at some point knight g5, let's say h4 at some point in knight g5, or bishop g5. The problem with this move is that white's plan is to go bishop c2 and queen d3, and black will more or less have to play g6 in order to stop this battery. And so in that regard, h6 is a very weakening move, since, for example, that pawn would be hanging now. So I played bishop b1, since if bishop c2, there could be knight c to b4 harassing the bishop. Bishop b1, knight back to f6, a3, so that after queen d3, again, there isn't this nuisance with knight b4. b6, queen d3, and king h8. So not a good move. Better was queen d6. But already there are some lines that show that white is better here, to say the very least. Basically, black can't really get rid of this construction, and this knight has to stay here, and if this knight can be dislodged, then black is in big trouble. So king h8. The point of this move was after knight e4. By the way, it's worth mentioning that here I still had around an hour left on the clock, while my opponent was down to maybe half an hour. So it goes a long way to show how good preparation and good preparation in general is very positive. Not that this was necessarily in my lines or in my preparation, but in general these themes, no matter what black plays, white almost always goes for the setup with the queen battery and tries to remove this knight. So knight e4 threatens to take and mate. So he must do something about that, and the idea of king h8 was to play knight g8. Now again, as I mentioned, this is not a good move. Feel free to try to find the best move here for white. Alright, I'm going to show it. It's knight g5. Not exactly a stunner or anything. It threatens mate. Note how f5 isn't possible because e6 would drop. And if the knight comes back to f6, there would be this cute move, knight h7, and putting the knight in the pocket there. And now something will fall here. So g6 was first, and now here's the really cool move, pretty move. So this time take a couple more time if you want. Alright, the move here that wins for white is knight takes e6. It's a nice shot. Basically this battery is too strong, so if f takes e6, this pawn is loose. You can take it, and there will be mate to follow here. So my opponent took with the bishop, and now rook takes, again, another sacrifice on the same square. And black can't take the rook for the same reason. So queen d7 was played, and now rook back to e1. And basically white has the bishop pair, more space, and is up a pawn, while black's pieces are all discoordinated, and the king is somewhat weak. So from here on out, it was just a matter of well, converting the advantage. There really wasn't much to it. Eventually, there was a fork and
check,
a double check, and black resigned. So that was my first round. Now the second round, I was paired against a unrated player, but yeah, he didn't didn't play like an unrated player at all. So he plays the Jabava system as white, and I go for e6, knight b5, and bishop d4
check,
check. Uh, More popular is knight e6, perhaps a more combative approach.
check,
Bishop b4 check, c3, bishop a5 to defend c7. And here comes a4. So white's immediate threat is to go b4 and a5, trapping my bishop on b6. So I must do something about that, and I went bishop d7. Now, this is not a bad move. a6 is an alternative, but it requires some very precise moves to get an equal position. Here, I'll just tell you that knight c6 is the engine recommended move, and it is the correct move. And yeah, that's quite peculiar. But bishop b7, again, is not a bad move. Queen d3, castles, b4, bishop b6, a5. Maybe white is taking things too quickly here on the queen side. There is this simplification, and the whole point of black's play is to play c6 to free the square for the bishop. So bishop c7, and basically white has all these pieces asleep. So I doubt that this is a real opening to try and get advantage as white. So e3 was played, knight d7, knight f3, queen b8, trying to make white take, so that then black can have this e5 break. White is stubborn and he plays g3. e5 still happens, trades, and the first mistake is knight takes e5. So black should have played something like bishop e2. Well, probably even an only move to remain to sort of balance the game. White is gonna castle next move, and black basically can't get to the white king before he castles. Now, after he trades, immediately there are some threats like bishop takes, pawn on c3 with check. So white is forced to trade further, and now queen c2 because his pawn is hanging. But you can see white is still 2 moves away from castling, and black's play will revolve around that now. c5 is a good move, breaking open the position. Rook d1, and this is probably the decisive mistake. White is taking way too long and is making moves that are not called for in the position. Again, bishop e2, bishop g2 were necessary. Black traded, and rook c8 and queen b1 was another grave error because it allows this check on e4. Actually, strongest in this position is knight e4, with remaining with the threat of check and also this fork.
check,
But check wasn't a bad move, and now knight e4. Here came rook takes pawn. It's already quite a precarious position for white, but f3 would have still allowed white to remain in the game. Rook takes pawn was just the final
check,
mistake. Queen c4 check, queen d3, and now tactic for black to win in 2 moves. What is it? It is queen takes rook, and after queen takes, knight c3
check,
with a double check, and black goes up a full rook. So this was the second round. Third round, I was white against a national master from Portugal, a fellow colleague of mine, soon to be FIDE master at the time. So the game started out with the Sicilian, French variation, and this line. So knight db5 is the most popular move, trying to get into d6 with check. Bishop b4 is one of the lines, one of the options, a3.
check,
So basically the first, let's say 10, 12 moves were all theory. This is all been played before a bunch of times. Castles, castles, d4, knight e2, bishop g4. So here there are some lines, there are some options for white. I chose h3. Perhaps slightly better is f3 or even bishop g5, but h3 is fine. He traded on e2, and you might be wondering, well, why has black just given up the bishop pair just like that? The position is open, so there's no reasoning for that. Well, this is a very topical line, even at top level, especially at top level. The point is that black gives up the bishop pair and has the two knights. In return, also has more space, and will get, with queen d6, more harmonious development and quicker development. It's also worth mentioning that the pair of knights is better to fight against the bishop pair than a bishop and a knight. So these are some of the justifications behind black's play. Bishop f3 came and rook ac8. Now, this move was a little bit too routine, perhaps. We discussed after the game that h6 was a potentially a better move, since it prevents this bishop from developing. If it wants to develop, it would have to go to d2, which is not a very happy square for the bishop. So rook ac8, bishop g5, and rook d8, rook e1. So eventually white has managed to get both of his bishops to nice squares and holds an advantage. But here came the first mistake by black, which was knight e5. Now this forces, after takes, rook b8, forces a sequence that is more or less forced. Black's point is to take on b2 on the next move, but now the bishop pair gets way too active with the first good move, bishop f4, forcing knight f d7, since if you take on b7, I'll take your knight, and then consolidate the extra pawn with b4. So knight f d7, and now bishop e4, rook takes b2, queen h5. So white has given the pawn back, but has tremendous activity for it, and the bishop pair is, well, shining in the middle of the board, so white definitely has a substantial advantage here. Queen g3, putting more pressure on the pinned knight, f6, and rook ad1. The computer shows that c3 was a better move. The point behind it being that if dc, queen takes c3, the position opens up even further. And with all these pins and the bishops in the center, after rook ad1, white is much, much better, probably winning. So I played rook ad1, wanting c3 on the next move to try to win the pawn. Knight c5, c3 came, d3, to try to hold on the pawn, but here comes this nice move, bishop takes d3, basically taking advantage of all the pins that exist. So this knight can't take because it's pinned to the rook. This knight takes, but now bishop takes e5 first. So the knight can't take because it's pinned to the queen. So the rook took it, and then we traded rooks, and I took the knight on d3. So I'm up one pawn, but that's very good. That gives white a nice advantage. But also this king is very, very weak because of this structure. You can see the 7th rank is really weakened, while white's king is much safer. So that's essentially the reason why black is losing, actually. The king is forced to eventually go to h6. If it stays on the back rank, it's just going to get mated eventually, or into a lot of trouble. And queen c8 was not necessarily the best move at all. Queen takes e7 would have been much better. And after queen takes c3, queen e7, wanting to go queen f8 check and driving the king further down. So queen c8, rook c2, which was probably not the best move either. And now queen f8 check, king h5, queen g7, queen f4. And here I took the pawn with check, which looks like the most natural move. But in fact, rook d5 check would have been much stronger, would have finished the game immediately. Well, it's also worth mentioning that since we got to this ending, sort of ending with the major pieces, we both had around maybe 2 minutes on our clocks, so that's sort of justification for our, a lot of the amount of mistakes we made. Basically after f5, there's g4 check, and after king g5, there's queen e7 check, and there's gonna be mate to fall in this position. So I took the pawn, which is also winning, but takes longer. Took the other pawn, he took on c3, queen e5 check, and now he tried to get, through a series of moves, he tried to get a queen exchange. Note that rook d5 doesn't win a queen, but moreover it loses the game, because note how h2 is controlled. So queen b4, rook c2, queen g4 check. And it seems like black is getting mated, but in fact he can always block with the queen. Now, it wasn't strictly necessary to trade queens, but I calculated a bit and I understood that the ending is completely winning. So I traded queens, went rook a1. And now, a bit of an instructive play, even though he's completely lost, for my opponent was to go rook c5 and rook a5. So basically, in rook endings, when your opponent has an outside pass pawn, you should try to block it as far back as possible. So this was, his best try. And here rook a3 is a nice move, or the beginning of a nice strategy. Basically, white wants to infiltrate the king, black doesn't allow it. And so white just sits, right? White just sits. If the rook goes back, the pawn keeps pushing. If the king comes this way, eventually the white king will be able to take these pawns. So white just waits, and eventually black has to concede a square to the white king.
Check.
And then came this nice move f4, and this was basically the end of the game. If black trades and takes on a4, white takes on f5, and these two connected best pawns win the game. So king d6, but this is still completely winning. So from here on out, it was just a very simple matter of technique. Let's skip forward to the end of the game. The pawns push, and eventually this little trick was tried. If I got carried away with g7, there would be rook takes h7, followed by rook takes g7 with a draw. But king g4 was the final move of the game. So this was my first breakthrough of the tournament, winning against, a very strong and respectable player here in Portugal. You can see his elo there is 2204, and currently, and it has been for at least half a year, his elo now is 2359, so big improvements there. And this was the third round against another FIDE master of our age. So this was in English, and we got into this sort of theoretical debate around here. This has all been theory so far. And here there are some moves. There's bishop d2, there's bishop e3, and there's bishop g5, which I played. Rook b8, rook ac1, h6, and bishop f4, knight g4. So here is basically the first not critical, but important position of the game. Now, rook fd1 would have been a very good move. And after knight e5, which was my biggest concern, because I didn't want to part with my dark squared bishop, there would be takes and c5, which is a very strong move. And after, for example, bishop e6, queen e3, h5, because the pawn was hit, b4, and you can see after queen d7, knight d5, that black is completely constrained, and for that reason, white holds a pretty good edge. So this would have been much better than my move, which was queen d2. Now, I wanted to provoke this move g5 before having to give away my dark squared bishop. I thought this g5 move was a little bit weakening for him, but it turns out that it's actually not, and he's actually controlling some dark squares, which is important because now he has the unopposed dark squared bishop. But the position remains right about even. So b5 is the typical freeing move in these positions. To gain some space, we traded knight d5, and it was important here to prevent this pawn from pushing further, so knight d5 came, threatening this one. e6 and knight b4. So I put a clamp on this pawn and also threaten a double attack. So he goes bishop d7, queen d2 defending this pawn and attacking on d6, rook b6. Now this move in hindsight was probably not necessary at all, because as you'll see in the game, rook c2 and d5 came. So if d5 had to be played, then perhaps rook b6 wasn't necessary. Now here came e4, d4, and here I made a mistake of playing f4. Now my idea was to go e5, right? Let's imagine some random move, e5, and this is very, very good for white, because this pawn is now defenseless, this bishop is out of the game, and this structure is very good. The bishop opened up, white is much better here. But the problem is black can trade and go e5, and after knight d5, rook d6, f5, which was the position basically that I hoped for, because you can see this knight here is a monster. This bishop has been shut out of the game, so has this one, and white has sort of an aggressive looking pawn structure. But in fact, there is no way to break through black's position, and so that just gives the game complete equality. So basically a misjudgment here. Black goes queen g5, and here I should have traded, and this would probably have led to a draw. But I played queen b4, which, well, I saw his next move, but I heavily underestimated it. So he goes rook takes d5, a very principled rook exchange sacrifice. And I took back, which, believe it or not, is a big blunder. Rook c to f2 was the best move. So just defending this pawn before taking the rook, and notice how the rook doesn't have any squares to go to. So that's the whole point behind this. But still, this would be a very hard position for white after rook c8 takes e4, and these two pawns just roll down the board with the bishop and the queen and the rook. The computer holds this, but it is very hard to play this as white. So I took on d5, which is even worse, because after bishop takes pawn, he gets these two pawns and also gets the f-pawn. So rook f2, king h1, trying to get out of the spin. Then came e4, rook f4, queen d5, and queen e7. So trying to create some chances around the king side. And after bishop e5, I got a miraculous shot here, basically, to hold the game. So feel free to pause and try to figure out what it is. It's not a sacrifice or anything, but it's just a very good move. I went rook g4, and you know, in the midst of an intense time scramble once again. Notice how this tournament was 90 minutes plus 30 seconds of increment each move, and there was no time added on move 40, so the time we had was for the whole game. So after rook g4, basically, I'm threatening for 1 to take on e4, taking advantage of this pin, and 2 to take the bishop and take the rook with mate. And these two threats are unstoppable all of a sudden. So he had to go back, and I could take on e4, because now the queen also looks at the square.
Check.
So we trade down into this ending, and white is just winning here. Now, even though white is winning, I made some inaccuracies. Here rook f2 was an inaccuracy. Rook g4 would have been better with the threat of rook g1. I went rook f2, d3, king g2. Apparently was a big blunder. Because after rook d8, threatening to push, rook d2, and he's got bishop takes b2 here, right? So if I take, he pushes, and he forces me to give up my rook. And basically he's taking some pawns here, and this is just a draw. But he played rook c2, and eventually I surrounded this pawn, and rook g3.
Check.
And after king h3, he resigned on move 45, because I'm going to take this bishop with probably some mate to follow. So another big result. Not exactly the smoothest game. It was being a very good game until the end, when, of course, okay, the time scramble did contribute to all the madness that happened, but still, some mistakes that should have been seen by both sides. So this was the 5th round. I was on 4 out of 4, and I was playing a much lower rated opponent. And yes, I'm not proud of my opening choice, the Bogo Indian. It's known to be quite drawish, and Spoiler alert, it so proved to be in this game. We played the main line, right flank as the bishop, castles, queen c2. Here came the first mistake, c5. It's not obvious at all why this move is a mistake. The point is, after e4, well, black has to go d5 or d6. But if black goes c takes d4, which is what I did in the game, white can go e5, knight g4, h3, knight h6, and knight g5. Which is a very nice shot. After queen takes knight, well, basically mate is threatened, and so is this bishop, that's loose. So if I take the knight, which I have to do, he takes my bishop and then takes my rook, and white is much better. He didn't see this, I played rook fd1. I went d6, he traded, e3, and here I completed development, he went knight g5. He was most likely seeking out a draw, because, well, this move is definitely not ambitious, trading the bishops. I went d5 to stop knight e4. And here we just shuffled on for a bunch of moves because basically no side has anything to do. Eventually h6, I made some, somewhat useful moves. Eventually knight bd7 came, h3, and a5. And I was trying to go a4, trade these pawns eventually with the rook there, and create a target on a2. Maybe even a passed pawn on the c file. He went queen a3, rook a8, and finally he blundered with knight d4. Now, I can't take because, well, my pawn is pinned to the queen. So he might have thought maybe the knight could get around somewhere. But after rook b7, cutting off the b5 square, it's clear that this knight is severely misplaced. And moreover, there's not much he can do. If he goes back, then it would be a4. And I'm just going to double or queen back and threaten to take. So the position all of a sudden is a bit hard for him, but he goes knight d to f3, and this was an even bigger mistake because after queen e4, basically this knight has no defense, and you'll see why in the game. His best option was to sacrifice the exchange here, but he is much worse. He would have been much worse. He went knight e2, because that was the only other square for the knight. Knight e2, knight e5 came, and this knight is overloaded. He went knight to g1, but after knight d7, I'm just simply threatening to trade and go with the other knight to e5, which is unstoppable. So he took on c5. I traded with knight e5 instead of taking the rook, which is stronger. He took on a5, and from here on out, a piece up. It was yet again a matter of conversion. This d4 move is nice, opening up my rook. Knight takes f2 was also a nice shot to finish off the game.
Check.
Knight h3,
Check.
rook e2,
Check.
and queen g2, checkmate. So I went to the 6th round, 6 out of 6. So I was having a really good run. And as you can see, a big slip happened in this round against an even lower rated opponent than the previous game. So we eventually transposed into a Najdorf, a6, a4, bishop e7, castles, castles, bishop e3. Very sensible development by both sides. This bishop d3 move is not really concise with bishop c4, right? Bishop b3 would have made much more sense. But bishop d3 was played, and I must admit it caught me a bit off guard. Not that this is particularly any great line for white, but it sure enough did its purpose. b6, f4, bishop b7, and rook f3. So my opponent played in a very direct way, swinging his rook to h3, and immediately looking at some breaks. Now, I should have either traded on d4 or went g6 to blunt off this diagonal. I took things too lightly here and went rook a8, possibly wanting to trade and go d5 or e5, depending. But I highly underestimated e5, which, believe it or not, wins the game immediately. So in 13 moves, or 14 moves, I was lost in this game. I took, because I have nothing better to do,
Check.
he took on h7, and I'm in king h8. Now, if knight takes, that basically forces him to win the game, so wouldn't have been in practical terms, would have been worse. The point is that after queen h5, he is just mating me. I would have to go f5, and he can take my knight, and it's a disaster, complete disaster. So I went king h8, and well, dazzled by the possibility of drawing a much higher rated opponent. Believe it or not, my opponent went
check,
bishop d3 check, king g8,
check,
bishop h7 check, and offered me a draw, which I accepted with, well, just as much excitement as him. Well, not exactly excitement of joy or anything, but more of relief. Basically, white is completely winning here with 94. Other moves also work, but 94 is good. It's not necessarily a stunner of a move or anything. He just wants to remove the defender around my king, and then bring the bishop back and queen h5, and there will be the same mating ideas. But I managed to get away with a draw this game. Yes, this was by far the worst game of my tournament, and something that just sits there, very much like the elephant in the room, in comparison to the other games. So this was my last game. I was on 6.5 out of 7. I had already won the tournament, and this is how my last game went. So again, in English, my opponent played in a very passive system, which allowed me to get a big space advantage and a big advantage overall. Now b3, 98, and here I played rook fb1, which I consider to be a strategical mistake, because after c5, even though he is much worse, he manages to close off the queen side. I should have traded first, and only then rook fb1 to try and go b4, and if c5, now I have these two squares. So rook fb1, knight a2, maybe looking at playing b4, f5. f5 was a bad move because after trades I went back to c3 and got hold of this e4 square. If he wanted to break here with f5, he should have played g6 first. So f5, we traded, knight c3, bishop back to d7, knight e4, knight f6, knight g3. Here we shuffled for a very long time until, well, you'll see what happens. We basically shuffled. I maybe can say I improved my pieces a bit. He eventually traded here, which was, well, relatively fine. Note that he is in a much worse position. And eventually that was shown with this move, knight c7, trying to get the knight out of Siberia, as I know King would say. But he unfortunately didn't have time for that, so after knight c7, feel free to see, try to see what the winning move is here for white. It's a nice little tactic. The move is knight takes h7, and he played knight f4, because if king takes h7, there would be queen takes h5 check, this pretty move, and just taking on g6 next, completely winning. So he played knight f4, I took that, and took on g6, so I basically shattered, well, not only shattered, I ate his whole protection around the king, and yes, I'm completely winning here in this position. Eventually I won that exchange and traded rooks, and my opponent resigned on move 41. So this was the first national, this was how I won my first national title, classical title of under 18. I look forward to winning, more of these titles. It's a great honor to win this title, and it's of great prestige. The games had, I would say, very nice quality for my for how I perceive my improvement and so on. Obviously, the sixth game against the 1600 was quite frankly a disaster. I just completely underestimated him, or at least his position. But yeah, in general, I feel like the games had good quality, and it is an important milestone. I'm still very happy about it, and this year I'll do my best to revalidate the title. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was definitely a bit longer than the other videos are going to be. And make sure to drop a like and comment if you learned anything new about the game. Other than that, I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.